I promise, I always rate movies with bear paws, so it's not just a gimmick for this movie. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the long-awaited 2020 X-Men superhero horror film, The New Mutants. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all that extra content. The New Mutants stars Blue Hunt, Maisie Williams, and Anya Taylor-Joy, and was directed by Josh Boone. It tells the story of Dani Moonstar, played by Blue Hunt, who awakens to find herself locked in a hospital with 4 other teenage mutants who are literally haunted by their pasts. Seeing this movie was a little bit surreal for 2 reasons. One, I saw this in the theater. Any other year, that wouldn't have seemed like a big deal, considering I typically average 2 trips to the movies every week, but as we all know, things have been a little bit atypical this year. And so this was my first movie at the theater in 5.5 months, which I think is actually the longest I've ever gone, since I started seeing movies in the theater when I was 4 years old. So that was the first surreal aspect, but the second is that this was the New Mutants. I mean, we've kind of gotten used to movies getting pushed back lately, but this film perfected it before it was the norm. It had 5 different release dates, and is now here nearly 2.5 years after its original date. The fact that this was my first movie back is just fitting. So, as is the case with just about every comic book movie I watch, I had no pre-existing knowledge of these characters or the original source material for the story. I've seen all the other X-Men movies, and I have to say, this one feels separate. And I think there are a lot of potential reasons for that, but I guess I was still a little surprised by it. There are a handful of references to the X-Men and to the Essex Corporation, which do tie this movie to the franchise, but not in a major plot way. So again, for me, not already knowing these characters, this film was basically its own standalone thing about kids with powers. And that's not a bad thing. I guess I just anticipated more of an X-Men feel to it all. Rather than the more typical superhero action approach that we usually see in this franchise, The New Mutants tries for an interesting cross between teen drama and horror. And right from the beginning, they've really marketed this as a horror movie. The trailers had looked excitingly creepy, and the premise sounded good for the genre, but I don't know if they pulled it off all that well. I think it's actually more a case of them overselling that this was supposed to be horror. Although it had a few creepy images every now and then, I personally wouldn't classify this as a horror movie, and with the almost episodic nature of the creepy sequences, this actually frequently reminded me of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Again, I wouldn't say that the tone was bad, it just wasn't what I was expecting. So where do the issues come into play? Well, most of this film's problems stem from the script. It's a bit hard to judge whether the issues originate with the source material, the original script, the edits used for extensive reshoots over the years, or Disney's acquisition and subsequent shutdown of the Fox X-Men franchise, but the script is a little lackluster. The plot's honestly a bit thin, which is a little surprising because it seems like there's a lot there to work with. They could have taken the story in so many different directions, but really didn't do all that much with it. I'm not going to spoil any of the plot here, but I thought it was going to be a bit more of an expansive story. A small, contained plot's fine, especially when you've got so many characters to work with, but unfortunately, it was pretty directionless for most of the movie, and by the time things start to come together plot-wise, there's only like 10 minutes left. With such a contained story, this movie's success really hinged on its characters, and I think they were okay. Again, to an X-Men outsider with no pre-existing knowledge of these characters, these kids could have been literally any superpowered kids for me. This seems like it was meant to be an origin story for this New Mutants team, so that could explain it, but they didn't even go by their superhero names yet. So they were just a group of kids that we sort of get to know through their nightmares. And I'll admit that it's kind of an interesting way to do character development in an ensemble movie like this, but it was definitely a little clunky at times. And things like the computer readouts and the lie detector sequence only added to that clunkiness. A little bit of exposition's fine, but there had to be better ways to incorporate that stuff into the story. In spite of the clunkiness, I did mostly like our mutant characters. Some of them started off a bit rough, but I was on board with them by the end. I think the performances were fine. Some of the dialogue was really weak, but again, I think there was more of a script issue than a performance issue. The movie definitely had some pretty good scenes, especially in the third act, but it felt surprisingly rushed for an hour-and-a-half long movie. As I'm sure is the case, given all of its production issues and the Disney buyout, this movie feels incomplete. It seems like it did originally have a more expansive story that got hacked up, and even though it mostly works as a standalone thing, it's clear that this was intended as the first movie of a series, both from a character and plot perspective. The movie's fine, but I'm really curious what this would have been like without all the delays and changes. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The biggest pro has gotta be the mutants. They were definitely a bit underwritten, and it took a while to get going with them, but I actually liked them and thought that they were interesting for the most part. The gradual reveal of what all their powers were was kind of a unique way to go, and worked for me because I didn't know before the movie. It was nice to get their backstories and see them interact, and fun when they were finally able to show off their powers. It could just be because this film didn't give the best sense of how much time passes, but it did seem odd how quickly the relationships among all the mutants evolved, so the third act felt a bit rushed character-wise, but I still liked them. On the con side, the biggest issue was how thin the plot was. In any other circumstance, I would have said that it was baffling how they did so little with such a promising premise, but it's not baffling at all here. This movie went through years of stagnation and reshoots, and a studio buyout that ended the franchise before the film was ever released. So, I get it. It's still disappointing, but I get it. I just wish they did more with the story. They hint at so many things. Stuff in the characters' backgrounds, the whole Essex Corporation thing, and then just don't go anywhere with most of it, opting instead for a fairly typical for the genre finale. The second con is the weak dialogue. This definitely stems from the same place as the first con, and that's the script. It's pretty obvious how chopped up this movie got, and how many hands were on it over the years, because sometimes things were fine. Sometimes the kids had this almost Breakfast Club rapport with each other and felt natural in their interactions, while other times they were saying the most cliché lines of dialogue, or just stuff that was obviously written by some old guy trying to sound like a teenager, so coming out of the mouth of an actual teenager, it sounds really awkward. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying any of the films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give The New Mutants 3 out of 5 paws. This was a fine movie. It has some problems, most of which can be traced back to the long history of production issues, but it was still an entertaining enough watch, and I'm glad I got to see it on the big screen. I would recommend The New Mutants to anybody who likes teen-oriented dramas, or what I guess we could call horror light. The characters are a bit underdeveloped, so it doesn't make for a big impactful story, but it does have a bit of a John Hughes vibe at times with its teen focus. The connections to the rest of the X-Men franchise are pretty minor though, so you might be a bit underwhelmed if that was your big draw for the movie. Similarly, if you're a fan of the New Mutants comics, I get the sense that this probably won't end up being your favorite movie. If you liked the New Mutants, I would recommend Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. There aren't any superpowered kids in that one, but it has a similar teen horror-ish feel, and also follows a group of teens as they experience various episodic nightmares. If you want another teen horror about a girl with powers, you should check out the original Carrie. There are some interesting parallels between some characters here, as well as a blood scene. And if you want another horror movie centered around a group of teens, you should definitely check out A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors. It too revolves around fear and nightmares, and is also set in a creepy hospital. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen The New Mutants? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite long-delayed movie? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainely Movies, the way life should be.